Uh, Good afternoon. I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Shanta Devarajan. I'm the Chief Economist for Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this global launch of the 2017 World Development Report, Governance and the Law. We have an exciting program for you today, so let's get started. And let me invite Mr. Jean-Marie Tétart, membre des députés in the French National Assembly, to give his welcoming remarks. Monsieur le député.
Merci, cher monsieur. Bonjour
Yes,
à toutes et à tous. Je
good
souhaite la bienvenue
afternoon
à
to
chacune
every one of
chacun
you. I'd
d'entre vous,
like to
en
extend a very
constatant
warm
que
welcome to
la diversité du
every
panel
one of you.
ici réunis
I
permettra,
noted
je n'en doute pas,
that
des
there is a
discussions
wide
riches.
variety of panel members,
Je voudrais
and we're
saluer
looking
particulièrement
forward to very
Monsieur
rich
Rioux,
discussions.
peut-être est-il
I'd
arrivé,
like to
mais enfin,
particularly
il est là.
salute Mr. Rémi
Je le
Rioux.
salue.
Maybe he's
Directeur
arrived.
général de l'AFD,
I'd like
Monsieur
to
Paul
salute
Robert,
him. He's the
économiste
head,
en chef de la
the
Banque
general
mondiale, pour avoir
director of
tenu
EFD, and Mr. Paul
présenter et
Romer,
débattre de ce
chief
rapport
economist at the World
ici à
Bank,
Paris, particulièrement
for holding
Je voudrais
this
saluer également
presentation,
Monsieur
this
Lopez Calva
event
et
here in
Madame
Paris, and more
Menezou pour la
specifically
qualité de leur
in these
travail.
premises. I'd like to pay
Que j'ai pu-
tribute
j'ai
to
pu
Mr.
plaisir
Lopez
d'être
Calva and
avec
Mrs. Young Meizu for the quality of their work, which I've had the pleasure of reading through and reviewing. Finally, I'd like to thank all those who participated to the organization of this conference, whilst defying all the constraints that required of in terms of the security and requirements. And I do would like to present my apologies to the guests who haven't been able to make it here as a result of constraints. Discussing such a report on governance and law, really, we are here at the National Assembly in a very relevant place to do so. And obviously, governance and the law is particularly relevant. We are here in 27, north and south, west as in east, as in most of our countries. All the electoral events have shown that there's been a failure in terms of the governances in place, incapable to, in the eyes of the citizens, to fully meet their inspirations to sustainable development. This report, should not be developed behind closed doors, but should involve a wide variety of players with an equal powers and as well as instruments. The governance can therefore be defined in an evolutive space of permanent negotiation at the national and local level. It entails duties and obligations as well as entitlements. This really has to reflect the players in negotiation with regards to challenges, objectives, as well as ways of functioning. Governance is therefore a process, and law must ensure that all stakeholders which are associated to this collectively set the rules of the game. All of this reminds me of experiences that I would refer to as four parties dialogues, in which local authorities as well as private and public operators, service providers, representative of users would define together negotiated pathways so as to develop in a differentiated and progressive way access to services. Therefore, I'd like to wish you all the success that your work deserves. And looking forward to the dissemination of recommendation of your reports for the purpose of defining not only with a burst of energy the political development and social inclusion. I'd also like to focus on the point that we need to have new elements to adjust our proposals in the field of development policies in our countries. We have indeed to push these higher still, but we have to make them more effective and efficient. I wish you an excellent conference. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Député.
Thank you very much.
And now let me ask Paul Romer, who's already at the stage, to
National
give his opening remarks.
Let me warn you that
I remind my students that there are three types of economists: those who can count and those who can't. There are also three types of economists: those who can speak French, those who can't, and those who can fake it. I will fake it, but switch quickly to English. Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, bonjour. Je tiens à remercier Monsieur
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'd like to thank Mr. Jean-Marie Tétart, Member of Parliament, as well as Mr. Rouy, General Director, Mr. Rémi Rioux, General Director of AVFT, for the purpose of launching the World Development Report. And this is a great honor to be in this highly symbolic place for democracy and for universal values. And I wish I could go on talking to you in French and addressing you in French, so I will revert to English.
We're here today to launch the World Development Report in 2017 on governance in the law. The World Development Report is the flagship publication of the World Bank, and this year's World Development Report deals with questions that are difficult but fundamental to the global development debate. The WDR, as we refer to it, contributes to an agenda pursued by the World Bank and many policy and academic organizations concerned with the question of state effectiveness. It starts by acknowledging that policies in general, such as those to improve the functioning of labor markets, overcome gender barriers, or prepare countries for shocks, are often difficult to introduce and implement because certain groups in society who benefit from the status quo may be powerful enough to resist the reforms needed to change the equilibrium. When bank economists refer to power, they're usually talking about electricity, but this report will try to change that. It tries to bring a broader interdisciplinary perspective to the policy setting and decision-making processes in a society, showing how power, as defined as the capacity of certain groups to influence policy and make others act in their own interest, is crucial to understanding the effectiveness of policies. Indeed, the WDR 2017 proposes an analytical framework drawing on game theory, the branch of social sciences that studies strategic behavior, to understand the dynamics of power, policy, and reform. In these terms, the framework is a two-level game. For years, the development community has focused on only the first-level game, the outcome game, in which actors react by making decisions about investing, consuming, working, paying taxes. This outcome game is played according to a fixed set of rules. But to make progress toward sustainable development, the report makes clear that we need to pay attention to a second-level game, the rules game, in which actors bargain to determine the rules that will guide the outcome game. A central message of this WDR is that this second-level game, the rules game, is where the action is, and that we frequently fail because we think we can insert a policy to influence the outcome game without asking, can it be supported, can it be sustained in the decision-making of the rules game? The report argues that the development community needs to move beyond asking what is the right policy and instead ask what makes policies in all areas effective for achieving desired outcomes. As this WDR suggests, the answer is related to the way in which state and non-state actors interact to design and to implement such policies. In a word, it is about governance. This message will have important implications for the way the development community approaches policy and governance reform in the coming decades. It has the potential to change the way we think about policy effectiveness. It's particularly useful in a context in which the political environment is complex and there are uncertainties and some degree of anxiety amongst citizens about the capacity of the system to respond to their pressing needs. We expect this report to help us focus on our mandate and deliver on it more effectively, which in the end consists of helping countries improve the lives of people in very concrete ways. Thank you very much again for hosting us here. Let me now ask the two co-directors to give you a somewhat more extended overview and elaboration of the report's findings.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm in the group of economists that don't speak French and are afraid to fake it. So I will speak in English. I want to start, on behalf of the team, I want to start by thanking our hosts, the French Agency for Development Cooperation, and of course the French National Assembly for allowing us to start this conversation here in Paris in this great environment. So thank you very much for that. I also want to thank, of course, our distinguished panelists for being here and, as I said, to help us start this conversation, which we hope will continue. And also thank you for being here and all the people who are watching us online. So the report was prepared by a team led by my colleague, the co-director John Mayo, and myself. So what I will do in this presentation is give you a brief, recollection of the narrative, the main elements of the narrative and the messages in the report, and then John May will continue with some of the operational potential implications of the report. First, I will start by saying that the report's main theme, as I was explained before, is how to be more effective in terms of our policy making. So the report asks questions that, for example, one of them is why are policies that we know that are not effective, however, very persistent, and it's very difficult to get rid of them. So we show one example here. We know that generalized energy subsidies tend to be regressive and inefficient, yet they are present in many cases and very difficult to change. Second type of questions is why policies that we know that could be potentially effective are not adopted. We showed the example of teacher absenteeism, which is very common in many countries, and we have come up with many technical solutions, technically sound solutions, well designed, that however have not been able to be effective in practice. So that's another important question. And finally, we also look at some policy solutions that, even though they don't seem to be the ones that technical advice would give you as first best, as we call them, actually result in effective results. So we want to have these type of questions in mind, and for that, well, we turn three typical responses to policy failures into questions, and these three responses will be these. The first one is policies fail because they didn't follow the best practice. The second is policies fail because of lack of capacity. And the third is policies fail because of lack of political will. What we say is we turn this into questions and say, why is it that something that worked in a context doesn't work in a different one? Second is, why is it that capacity is not built in terms of specific needs that could lead to more effectiveness? And third is, what is the incentive structure that makes actually policymakers not, or the incentives to policymakers not compatible with the specific policies that could be effective. So in order to address these type of questions, we look at vast literature that involves, as was mentioned before, game theory, transaction costs economics. We look at political economy and political science, socio-legal studies, and so on. So we try to gather all this literature and try to translate it into a framework that can allow us to actually address these questions successfully. The main goal, if countries care about, if societies care about freeing their people from the threat of violence, if they care about prosperity and about how that prosperity is shared, we would like to see how we can design and implement policies that lead to these three outcomes. And what we say is we have to look at, as Paul mentioned before, how the agreements are reached and sustained among actors so that policies can be effective. And that's what we call governance. We define governance then as the process through which state and non-state actors interact to design and implement policies, and these actors interact in a space that we call the policy arena. This policy arena is shaped by both formal and informal rules. So typically the instrument that we have to try to reshape this arena is formal law. And actually we look at how law plays different roles. One of those roles is we want law to actually effectively change behavior. It is not always the case because formal law interacts with many other normative frameworks. And then it's only partially a determinant of behavior. I show on the right-hand side here an example of, this is the year in which gender quotas were formally passed as law in different countries, and the year in which they were actually implemented. So we see the first case of Bangladesh, where there is a lag of more than 20 years for implementation. We have another example like this one, which is Korea, and we have a lot of heterogeneity in terms of how formal law eventually leads into implementation, because, as I said, formal law is only one of these instruments that shapes behavior. And we want to shape behavior in very specific ways. What we see is that policies that are effective tend to change behavior in the following way. One is by providing credible commitment devices, so that, for example, policies that have long-term objectives are not changed when circumstances change, so the agreements among the actors is sustained. Second is when announcements and policies are credible enough so people can shape their own expectations and make decisions according to specific outcomes, decisions related to investment, to savings, to consumption, and so on. And finally, we want people not to free ride on others and to comply with the rules, what we call cooperation. So if we induce these three types of behavior, policies tend to be more effective. But what prevents these functions to be performed effectively? We look at how unequal distribution of power in society may, under certain conditions, prevent functional effectiveness or get in the way of functional effectiveness. So three manifestations of these power asymmetries that we analyze. One of them is when systematically certain actors are excluded from the policy arena. So that is what we call exclusion. Second is when some actors are actually benefiting from the status quo and prevent the rules to change, which is the case, for example, I mentioned before about the energy subsidies. So those who are benefiting from these subsidies will oppose to change. And finally, clientelism, which means basically that the transaction or the relationship between politicians and public officials and citizens, instead of becoming one of accountability, becomes actually a transaction. So in that case, for example, that we're talking about public service providers who do not provide the service as expected, is in many cases because they actually get the politicians elected, and they can get away with not providing those services. After describing all these elements, the report has the message that actually change is possible. But we have to understand what are the entry points so we can actually move at the margin or adapt at the margin to a path that is more consistent with the long-term objectives. One element of that is the incentives, how to reshape effectively the incentives for those who are close to the decision making in order for them to actually adopt rules that constrain their own power. The second is by reshaping preferences. So basically preferences are not static, preferences evolve, and preferences can be shaped through many mechanisms like public deliberation. And the idea is how, by changing the preferences, you can actually make the policy making more consistent with the development objectives. And finally, the idea of reducing the barriers for other actors to enter into the policy arena. So those who are controlling policy making have incentives to increase barriers so others cannot access this policy arena, and we want these entry costs to be lower, so more people, if they feel so, they can participate in the policy making. And that's what we call contestability. So these are the three entry points that we analyze in depth in the report. But of course, who are the agents of change? Those are the entry points, but some agents have to bring about change. So one possibility is that elites or those who are close to the policy making actually reach coalitions or agreements in order to change the rules. The other is that citizens create coalitions among themselves or with elites to bring about that change. And finally, how international actors, and this is very important, can also influence the relative bargaining power of those in the domestic arena. So this is just to summarize what Paul just mentioned, that we typically focus on what we call the outcome game, but we want to bring attention to the idea of this second level game, which is the rules game. So three main elements in the report to summarize. One is function versus form. We have to be concerned about the functional effectiveness and not only about which is the best form to be adopted. Second is that unequal distribution of power can be manifested in ways that is detrimental for this functioning, which is basically the idea of exclusion, capture, and clientelism. And finally, that change, however, is possible. We can effectively change incentives, reshape preferences, or bring more contestability into the policy arena. So just one final point in these 10 seconds is that typically, we call this in the report the policy effectiveness cycle. Typically we would start in point 4, which is basically looking at what is the best form that has worked somewhere else and try to adopt it to a different context. What we say is we have to think before that about what is the type of functional problem that we're facing, what are the type of power asymmetries that is intervening in the process, and what is the possible changes in terms of incentives, preferences, and contestability, and only then see what is the form that can lead to that type of change. So this is really a very brief summary of the main elements in the report, and as we see it is rather an invitation for you to read the full report and provide your comment. So I will let now, you may talk a bit more about what is next in terms of operational implications. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are two types of economists. Some want to change the world, and some don't. And I assume most of us are here because we care about international development and want to play a constructive role in that process. Now, this WDR would not be successful if we do not provoke you to re-examine the working assumptions of how change actually happens and what our constructive role in this process might be. Allow me to share some reflections as a practitioner who has had the luxury of 1 year of sabbatical in the research department as a co-director of the report, and now taking up a new challenge to put these ideas into practice. As I reflect on the very rich literature that we take seriously in this report, I will highlight 3 strands that have major operational implications for us. The first strand is related to the political origins of big changes in rules, such as legislative oversight, civil service meritocracy, government transparency, women's suffrage. In societies who, over time, difficult political battles took a long time, and to install those rules that today we took for granted. The suffragettes, for example, sacrificed their lives, jobs, and families to fight for the right to vote. The transition from patronage to meritocracy took decades in the United States, even after the Pendleton Act was passed. The Indian Rights to Information legislation was the result of a 10-year campaign led by grassroots NGOs, joined by journalists, business, lawyers, and policymakers. But when we go to a developing country today and advocate for changes of these rules, how often do we investigate the stakeholders who are fighting for or against the status quo? Are there change champions, and how strong is their coalition for change? Why are elites interested in changing those rules that limit their own power? We need to ask these questions to know whether there is really opportunities for success. Now, within this strand of historical literature is also a literature on the co-evolution of institutions and economy in today's rapidly developing countries. These countries achieved tremendous progress with very mediocre institutions to start with. This really shouldn't surprise us, because that's the case for developed countries when they were poor as well. This literature helps us understand that there are many ways to achieve credible commitment, cooperation, and coordination, even when rule of law is lacking and democratic accountability is limited. Many people are not very comfortable with this literature because it feels as if we have given up our principles. But this literature forces us to look at the relative strengths in each country and craft solutions that really build on their foundations. It also forces us to think about the long-term implications of different patterns of development. A growing economy with shared prosperity might generate the type of preferences, beliefs, and capacity that create further momentum for change. In contrast, growth that does not create shared prosperity might create social division, conflict, and stagnation that we see around the world today. The second strand of the literature examines reform processes as chess games. The most informative work tells us not just what the reformers did, but in the context of the strategic behavior of resistance and undermining activities of the status quo defenders. For example, how did the Philippine sin tax was finally introduced with merely one vote of margin? How did 5 successful African cities manage to reform their water utilities and deliver drinking water to urban poor residents when others failed? If we think about every reform as a chess game, then every failed reform is more data to help us understand the strategy of opposition. If we were able to accumulate from these failures, not just repeated disappointment, but actually a strategy book, then over time we could better anticipate moves by the opposition and adjust strategies accordingly. The third strand of the literature relates to quantitative examination of the risks and impact of capture, exclusion, and clientelism on the one hand, and quantitative evaluation of practices that aim to minimize the impact of these asymmetries of power. What is the best way to reduce the risk of collusion between environmental auditors and business, for example? In countries where the regulatory capacity is weak, especially when facing a large number of small and medium enterprises, what type of government business consultation mechanism can generate the legitimacy of these regulations and produce the most voluntary compliant behavior? This WDR will not give you concrete answers to all your specific reform challenges, but what we hope is that it will make you ask these questions as you try to effect change. Let's all consume and accumulate more knowledge about historical evolution of institutions, strategies of change coalitions versus the oppositions, and empirical efficacy of proposed solutions. Only then we will be more effective change agents to build a world of peace, prosperity, and equity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Young Mei and Luis Felipe. So now we've heard from the authors of the report, or the directors of the report. The authors are also sitting here. And now it's time to hear what other people think of what they did and said. So we have put together a panel of 5 distinguished individuals, and I will just say a few words about each of them when I introduce them. They're going to make their initial comments, and then we might have a little bit of a discussion among the panelists for a second round. So our first speaker is Avinash Dixit. He's a professor of economics emeritus at Princeton University and a long-standing contributor to this literature, some of which Young Mei referred to earlier, on non-market interventions in the economy. Avinash?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shanta, and the team for including me on the panel. It's been a great pleasure to read the report, and let me congratulate the team on producing it. I found it a very well-written and comprehensive overview of ideas and examples about the role of governance and law in the process of economic development, and a very valuable summing up and reminder for researchers and practitioners of development policy. With the very little time available, I'm going to leave out all the specifics, some of which came out before, and focus on what I think captures the underlying philosophy of the report. Namely, that to understand the issues and make policy that actually works in reality, analysis has to be done at greater depth and greater breadth than is often the case. Depth means examining causes and effects at a more basic level. For example, the rules game has an underlying basis that ultimately governs the outcome game. We can manipulate the outcome game unless we know how the rules game works. To understand human behavior for purposes of designing incentives, we've got to trace it down to basic psychological and sociological determinants. And the policymaking process has to be examined in terms of power relations among the participants. Breadth is perhaps even more important. It means not stopping at what's the conventional disciplinary boundary of economics, but bringing in all the social sciences that bear on the issues: history, law, politics, sociology, psychology, and using all the available methodologies, game theory, analytic narratives, case studies, etc. Lack of depth would bring in what economists call the Lucas critique, namely the relationships that we take for granted in making policy might themselves shift as a result of the policy. Lack of breadth would risk missing some aspects that other disciplines have to bear on the issue, and economics, for example, quite arbitrarily declared to be outside its scope. One way to put it is that the really important thing is to realize that the purpose here is not to get another publication in Econometrica or the American Political Science Review, but to be effective in making policy, and the needs of that cut across what are disciplinary boundaries that researchers normally would try and respect. There are a lot of examples of this in the report, and some of them might come up in further discussions. But I want to kind of qualify this a little bit by saying that the search for depth and also to some extent search for breadth, is unending and may ultimately become counterproductive. So in philosophical jargon, you can't carry reductionism to the ultimate end. And sometimes many of what are called emergent or more surface level phenomena can be usefully understood in their own right. Going outside the development example, perhaps the best example comes from macroeconomics, about which Paul Romer has written very forcefully. Economists who brought in the Lucas critique searched for depth, but they stuck to the narrow perspective of the way economics describe preferences as exogenous, selfish, etc., etc., and thereby left out a whole lot of things that bore on the situation in important ways. Keynes simply asserted that his consumption function was a fundamental psychological law that was leaving out depth, but he was, in the analysis that went with it, bringing in a whole lot of breadth that was relevant. So what is the optimal level of depth and what's the optimal extent of breadth? Determining it is not really a science. That requires some combination of experience, judgment, and just simple common sense. The thing is that doing research or doing policy analysis is an art, and I can't prescribe precise scientific methods for achieving the optimum. Has the World Development Report team found the optimum? Probably too early to say. That will come out in the way in which people read and use it, but I certainly think that they've done a very good job. And I think this report will be the go-to source for development practitioners and also people interested in the problems of development for many years.
Thank you very much, Avinash. That was great. Now let me turn to our second speaker, Rebecca Greenspan, who is the Secretary General of the Ibero-American Secretariat General. And let me also mention that Rebecca has to catch a flight for which she has to leave at 7 p.m. sharp. So if she leaves while we're still going on, it's not because she's offended by what we've been saying or anything like that. Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Shanta, and let me thank the French Parliament and AFC for having us here and for being our host. Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be with my fellow panelists today. Let me start by saying, like it was said before, that I think really that this report is a milestone, not only because of its analytical framework, but also because of its impact, possible impact and influence on the way we look at policy and decision-making to achieve reform. And because it brings, again, research putting people in the center, and the science and the evidence up front. So really thank you very much, and congratulations to the World Bank for being brave to bring this to us, and also to the authors of the reform. So let me try to emphasize some of the things that I think are very important in the reform. Not saying also that I think that for all of us this is very timely. Really, I think that the world has been taken by a storm last year, with the very worrisome signs of higher fragmentation in societies all across the Western Hemisphere. And many people feel that globalization have left them behind, and that their governments have become overly responsive to elites, turning their backs on the ordinary citizens or the working classes. So we need to think and find new ways to listen and to include all these groups and to ensure, really, a large-scale participation and buy-in from all the groups in society. And we have to validate and address the sense of vulnerability and uncertainty that large segments of the population are currently feeling. So, to address this, we need to go back to politics with capital P, yes, and to the governance problem. And politics matter, and we have to think about it, really, if we are serious about effectiveness of policies and reform. So let me stress some of the points the report makes. First, the issue of inequality. And the issue of inequality is not only about income, but also about the ability to influence policy decisions. So people want also political goods, not only consumer goods or services. They want political goods. And the report brings that very strongly to the floor. For example, in Latin America, 90 million people have joined the middle classes in the last 15 years. They want to have more voice. They want the institutions to be responsive and accountable to previously marginalized groups and individuals. And if we are not able to do this and the institutions are not able to respond, we will fail. Second, the issue of effectiveness and sustainability of public policies that depend also on shared expectations over time. And when we have such fragmented societies, when we don't meet each other anywhere, we don't meet in the school, and we don't meet in the health centers, or even in the shopping malls or in the parks, when societies don't meet anywhere, and we have that in the region I represent, in Latin America, so how are we going to put together these shared expectations? How we are going to put together and negotiate a common project of society where within our differences, we want to walk towards it. So we need to address this. Third, the report brings corruption in any of its form in detrimental, corruption that is detrimental to effectiveness of specific policies. But I think that the point that it makes is that it erects structural barriers to overall development. For example, through meager or regressive taxation or underinvestment in public goods and services. And here is where the contestability and more competition comes in to combat political capture and clientelism. Fourth, I want to celebrate the strong focus on long-term trends that the report brings forward. Even today, and for lack of a better measure, people often assume short-term economic growth as a measure of success. And non-necessary democracy brings an answer to short-termism. In my country, we say the problem is that someone eats the pineapple, but the other has the stomachache. And in politics, you have that. When you have to invest in the long term, you cannot bring the fruits of the long term today for your political, in the political competition, but you will suffer the lack of long-term views afterwards. And we don't usually make accountable those that didn't take the right decisions 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So the focus on the long term, and especially now where short-termism is back also in economics and in our political behavior, I think that is very important. And finally, let me bring three principles that the report does that I think that are really in place. First, think not only about the form of institutions, but also about their functions. Think not only about capacity building, but also about power asymmetries. And my favorite, think not only about the rule of law, but also about the role of law. So bringing that together, this is a very complex issue. I think that the report does a wonderful work in trying to put a framework by which we can help thinking about policy effectiveness and reform for having more equal and a better society. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Okay, our next speaker is Friederike Roeder, who is the director of One France, an NGO based here and a global one as well. Friederike.
Et attention, je vais parler en français.
Careful, I'm going to be addressing you in French.
Donc oui, je suis directrice de One en France.
So I'm the director of One France, and we are an international NGO. And first of all, I'd like to thank organizers for inviting us. I'd like to salute the World Bank as well as the team that have been involved in drafting this report. It goes beyond being merely polite. This is a most interesting report, and what has been drafted here is most relevant. I'd like to pay tribute to those who drafted the report. And when it comes to governance and the law, with a view to achieving global development, peace, and shared growth. Unfortunately, these days we need to underline that these are not to be taken for granted. And so I'd like to join our representative from the National Assembly. I'm definitely hoping for a bust of energy, a big push when it comes to development institutions as well as the states and governments. So in our view, improving governance, making a governance more effective is based on the model underlying One, i.e. the participation of citizens. This is the model according to which we work along in France with local authorities in Africa, in Nigeria, where we want to fight for a better governance, and notably in the field of public health. And I'd like to come back to the introductory remarks. Citizens' participation, citizens' engagement does shape the debate at different levels. First of all, not only about accountability, apologies, but this is about reshaping the preferences, quote unquote, apologies for my English, but this is about the preference of stakeholders as well as incentives. So I do believe that citizens' participation is crucial from different respects. Now, just a couple of avenues we could explore when it comes to governance. I come from a more pragmatic background. I'd like to start with the theory. It's important, nevertheless, but it boils down to the definition of governance. But we want to go beyond the principle, making it reserved with governments, and we need to go beyond beyond the definition, because the governance can be understood as government, and we can see this in the formidable work of local advisors, notably in the Syrian opposition ranks, but also as a result of the digital revolution and disruptive technologies such as the blockchain. And blockchain does no longer need the governance or the state to work. And so it is about developing an analytical framework so as to support development purposes across all sectors is really important. Fighting extreme poverty is becoming, has always been a challenging issue. It gets ever challenging these days, but this is about supporting governance as a sector of its own. And sometimes what happens in the past that it was easier, let's say the way it is, to boil down, to reduce the governance to supporting economic governance, so strengthening of the capacities from the Minister of Planning and Finance. And notably, when reading the report, I hope you all agree that this is not sufficient at all. This doesn't suffice, and we need something akin to political governance. So, because we are here sitting in this very symbolic place, we need the support of the parliaments, the National Assembly, but not only that. So we have to, I wouldn't be representative of an NGO if I wasn't tackling the development budget. France only gave 2% of its public development help to the sector of governance, and that is very little. And we have to reckon that there is an eminently financial topic, but however, governance also entails the how. How can we support governance, notably from a financial resources standpoint? I think there's interesting discussions to be had. And just to put my foot in it, is that when it comes to the limitations of the World Bank, when it comes to translating the report into operational guidance, as well as the interest of supporting governance when it comes to the EFD. So who does what in this sector? And I think what matters most, if we're serious about supporting our governance, and notably for a government such as the French government, an important donor, is all about risk-taking, because supporting political governance, supporting the participation of citizens, obviously means supporting political change, and necessarily it is something that requires a risk-taking probably more or greater than what has been done up to now by all the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci, Frédéric. All right, now let me turn to Gaël Giraud. He's the chief economist of the Agence Française de Développement for his remarks. Gaël.
Thank you. So I definitely belong to the class of economists who speak English and who want to change the world. But being French and in a French parliament, I will speak in French. Je crois que ce rapport est absolument fondamental et il arrive à un moment crucial pour nous, à l'AFD, parce que l'Agence française de développement a reçu
The French Development Agency was mandated by the French government on the matter of governance. It is an opportunity for us to contribute to the reflection. And the first thing that we can note as a result of this report is that it reflects quite a profound mindset change from the part of the international community compared to that of the 90s. So governance and related policies was entailed the precise concept of counterbalancing, and with some prejudice, i.e. the North community will enlighten the South as to what it is, what good governance is, with good tips along the way thrown in. And today's report is a completely different take on that. This is about trying to learn from our failures. Let's recognize that a number of our initiatives have failed. Let's understand what we can do about it when it comes to governance, and that is a tremendous, quite a drastic change in mindset. So I'll be very brief. The first one is about the theories of the games, and apologies for those who are not familiar with these, but we absolutely need to continue understanding more how coalitions work in a game. The whole mechanism is designed in the theory of the games is, well, the theoreticians of games try to understand how we can develop games to understand the interactions, and the value point is about the shaping of coalitions and how can coalitions impact a bias as to the end resolutions, i.e. we don't know how to develop auctions rules that are compatible, that can be compatible with the possibility for coalitions to hijack the games to their own end. So it has a considerable impact from the analysis standpoint. Now, in the theory of the games, teach us that the situations that we analyzed always entail multiple equilibriums, and so there's always a problem, as some of these, notably from social equilibriums, are very detrimental. How can we develop rules, laws, enabling the stakeholders to work on a more equal footing compared to the current situation? How can we design the very rules of the games? So this is the second level, the rules of the game. It's not only about changing the balance, but about changing the very rules underlying the games. And that is absolutely fundamental. And what's paradoxical here is that once we set this question forth, then the next question is going to be how can shape the rules underlying the games. So who can change the third level of in terms of the games, the next level up, and that is particularly enshrined in today's report. Beyond that, when it comes to economic theory, this is about the relationship that economic elite entertain with the rest of the population. We're very much confined to a vision that has been very often highlighted with the likes of Daron Acemoglu or Douglas North or Asim Gas, those chief economists, and we are, as economists, what is the relationship that economists entertain with the rest of the population? That's one of the points highlighted by this report. And we have to map the current relationship between the stakeholders in a given country, in a given region. But when it comes to power relations, the next level is how could elite start listening to what the rest of the population wants to tell them. Just to be very concrete, I'd like to tell you, to give you an example, at the Davos Forum, we set the price of the CO2 tons by $50–60. And we decided to send. It was decided to send non-elite ambassadors to explain to the pollutions why a price had to be set for CO2. So it is about listening to the rest of the population as opposed to starting from the idea that we'll continue teaching the population what we know. And the third point, and I'll leave it at that, is reflects on the type of relationship that we want to review and analyze. And the report is highlighting matters pertaining to the state. And what Frederick has highlighted earlier is about the focus on the civil society stakeholder, that is neither the state nor the businesses, but the NGOs, civil societies, international NGOs and players. And there's a whole set of resources of goods that could be focused on, that are the commons, i.e. common goods. The commons is about neither public institutions or the market forces, but hybrid institutions, PPPs, NGOs, consumers associations. So these goods, the commons, Nordstrom studied them for years, and she showed that in the mapping that she developed of the institutions unable to manage these types of goods, that there is a central question at the heart of this. Who is entitled to change the rules of the commons? So I'm coming back to the theory of the games. Who can enact the game's rules? Who can change those? And what can we do collectively to give us the right in an effective way to change rules of the games we all play together? So hence the interest of this report, for the aforementioned reasons, totally changes the perspective that we can have on development. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Gaël.
Thank you very much, Gaël.
I'll hand it over to Paul Romer, who will make some remarks, but also pose some questions to the panelists in addition. Go ahead, Paul.
So let me try and connect some of the remarks with thoughts they spurred for me. Both Avinash and Gaël pointed to the complexity of the theoretical framework here, and thereby the complexity of the social processes that we're trying to understand. I think implicit in both of their remarks, perhaps explicit, is the recognition that we can't tell if the theoretical framework in this report or any other framework like it is correct simply by examining the document. The ultimate test has to be one of pragmatic use. If I can invoke one of the truly successful reformers of recent history, in the words of Deng Xiaoping, it doesn't matter what color the cat is as long as it catches the mouse. So there's something, I think, powerful about the willingness to use complicated frameworks to recognize the complicated realities that we deal with. And I think this was also highlighted in Young Mei's remarks. But having recognized all that, we still try, and the test is, does it catch the mouse? Do we succeed? Sometimes it doesn't, but we can learn from that. Sometimes it does. And I think that's what's unusual and encouraging about this report, is the embrace of complexity, in a sense an admission of humility about how little we know for sure, but yet the confidence to say, we will try and we will pay attention and see, are we successful more frequently now or not? And if we stick to that awareness of the complexity and humility and pay attention to the evidence, we'll do a better job of meeting our ultimate goal. Now, the question, I guess, and I think this is more for those of us in the bank, is how could we start to articulate in advance and then measure, even roughly, yes, no, are we succeeding? Did we catch the mouse? We look to see, did the road get built? Did the water system get turned on? But that's actually not what any of us are thinking of as the success or failure of these projects. And we could get the road built and fail, or we could have the road not get built and succeed. So how could we start to work towards those pragmatic measures that can inform our learning process?
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. So that question will apply to all the panelists if they want to come back. But let me add a few of questions of my own that were triggered by the very interesting and important comments made by the panelists. Actually, I want to come back to Avinash's point about instead of going into great depth, let's try to do some immersion and go in to other disciplines and fields. So if I could ask him to be a bit more concrete and to say what would a research agenda look like in order to pursue those questions, if he can guide us. I mean, one thing when you do a WDR is that the team is sort of so exhausted that then we start discussing operationalization. But let's keep in mind that there's a whole research agenda facing us as well, and we'd really like to get your get your advice. And Rebecca was talking about, was welcoming many of the directions in which this WDR was taking us, which is very welcome. But I want to ask if you could reflect, and maybe Frederica as well, about are there certain things that we are currently doing that we should not do or stop doing? What are the things, what are the practices that are actually standing in the way of better governance? And let me provoke a little bit Frederica's comments as well when she said that there were limits to what the World Bank can do and what the maybe AfD can do. I'm wondering, are there limits? I mean, there were people who thought that the World Bank would never write a report like this, right? But we have. So the question is, what are those limits? Where do you think we should stop, or do you want us to continue pushing the boundaries? So let me turn to Avinash.
I think I can just best begin where I left off, which is doing research is an art. And in the same way, setting up a research agenda is also something of a work of art. I think from what I've seen of the process by which WDRs came together, they've got pretty much the right process. They identify a set of issues. A couple of people take the lead, see who else might be interested. And I bet as a discussion or brainstorming in the group goes on, someone says, oh, this is something about which maybe Acemoglu knows something, or maybe this is something about which some political scientists know something. So they bring them in for little bits of advice and bat those around, and gradually questions and ways of looking at them get formed. The important thing really is to have a team with different disciplinary experiences, but open-minded enough to have respect for each other, to have respect for experts from other fields, not be like what at one time, for example, Chicago economists like Stigler and Becker used to be. They thought that economics had all the right answers, and its job was to go out like imperial colonizers to other fields. What we need is not a takeover, but a genuine merger of social sciences. And from what I've seen of the WDR team in the working stages, I think they've got it very much right.
Thank you. Rebecca? Oh, do you want to jump in? Okay, go ahead.
On that point, it occurs to me as I think about other academic fields that if we're looking for cases of dysfunction to practice solving, maybe we should visit some universities and experiment on them before we touch any more countries. But more seriously, there has been a very interesting trend that many of you are aware of, where economists are taking more seriously the field of psychology. And that's been helpful and will have some lasting both substantive and methodological effects. But I want to make the case that the place now where we should listen is anthropology. Anthropology is a complicated place that has very little consistency and lots of people fighting with each other. I call it the Balkans of academic life. But there is a particular group associated with Joe Henrich that's been looking carefully at this process of the social accumulation and the social determination of notions about right and wrong and how we behave, even what we know. And I think the real power will come when we take the concepts from psychology but link them to this social interaction dynamic. And there are some very promising lines of work in anthropology.
Okay, let me turn to Rebecca then.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, but I think that yes, I would say that there are things. I won't say that we have to stop doing them, but we have to think about them differently. That I think that is what the report really tries to do. Let me give you an example. When we discuss about budget in public services, and we want universal access to those services, to education and to health. Well, many would say, well, you know, you have to finance from your budget only the very poor that cannot really buy the goods by themselves and provide themselves alone with education and health. But in some of the countries, you will say, well, but that will break the alliance between the poor and the middle classes. And so how do you do that without ending up not financing services for the poor, but with poor services for the poor, because the voice that will demand quality from the services is not there. And those are the type of things that I think that this report brings to the forefront. Let me give you a second example. Privatization. In many countries, probably, there are things the state is doing that maybe the private sector will do much better. And so we talk about privatization. But what happens when the state is really co-opted by very strong interest groups? So privatization will be done not in a very competitive way, not in a very, contestability way, but it will only do what anyway will happen within the state, but you will take the price of the interest group or the utility of the interest group many years to the present, in present value, instead of really being able to improve the services or to distribute power and services much better in your country. So if you don't bring what this report brings about, that is to think about those issues as very fundamental for the policies to be effective, you will take the wrong choices. And let me, having been in politics, a big part of, an important part, not big, but an important part of my life, and having been in civil society and in academic world, let me tell you that we have taken the wrong decisions precisely because we haven't really seriously done the right analysis about the asymmetries and the power relations and the alliances that we want to put forward for the policies really to have get the objective we want and to stay in time, not to be able to get back and not be sustainable. And I think that's why I'm so really happy about the report, because I really think many of the international institutions, and I have been in one, have not taken, this wide approach, and I love this merger of social sciences, because when you break the silos, you will be able to do it much better for the right policies to be in place.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Frederique, do you have any?
Thank you very much. So first of all, first and foremost, I'm optimistic and I believe in change. So I also believe in change for what we're doing and the way the ideas we have and the approach we have. But what I would like to say is that there are several factors that need to be taken into account if we want to support governance as a mandate of the institutions, first and foremost. And I can just repeat what I've said. It's fantastic that this report exists. has been published, and I don't think that we could have imagined it just a few years back, so everything is possible, and we're trying to move the lines. Then, having said that, there was also the question of how can we support governance, and there's all that whole aspect of often is a question of very small projects which don't have a lot of influence, which demand a lot of staff, more technical assistance, and I think that the banks can play a role at that level, but I think there are also other actors that can take on other roles, and I would also like to attract your attention to a process which has happened at the European level a few years back, which I find interesting. It's that the Eurodeputies, Euro MPs realized the limits that they were facing and that the system of aid of the European Union was putting in place. So they created a specific foundation called the European Endowment for Democracy with financing which were not massive with regard to the figures that the World Bank has. I'm thinking about a few million euros, 10 million euros per year, but which can finance projects which are much more political. They can be very small, but they can have a big impact, I believe. And there are other foundations which do similar work to that, and I think it's important to recognize the diversity of the actors that you need to have and want to see intervene in this domain and to sustain this and to support this diversity. So I would not like to answer the question, what do we need to stop doing, but rather I would like to answer the question, what should we do? Because it's true that the analytical model can appear quite complex, but I quite agree with Paul Romer. It's at the end of the day what counts is the result, and I think that there are ideas which are very concrete, which exist, and paths that we can follow. I think that what we can do is that we can invest much more in supporting political governance, and that is to say direct support. You can't support a parliament going through the executive, for instance. And what is very often done, and I know that because I have worked personally with an African parliament before I started my work with one. You have to think about there are contexts in which you have to face up to realities. There is no way, in effect, of supporting better governance going through the executive and the government. You have to have this as direct support with institutions like justice and parliament, but there also has to be a direct support to the citizens. And I think there again we come back to that question: governance. Does it have to be linked? Does it always link to state? And it's not the case, I believe. I think there are a whole array of small initiatives which exist today, which have an impact at a local level, where, for instance, the citizens they take hold and the ownership of the new technologies in order to improve transparency, for instance, to ask their people to be accountable, the people who are governing them regionally and nationally. And those are initiatives which need to be supported much more. And then something else which I didn't mention, and it is these are other actors that we're talking about now who are responsible at this level and who need to react. It's everything to do, of course, with how can we improve governance at the international level, in particular fight against illegal money flows. And I was delighted to see that this is addressed also in the report. And there's a lot of things, a wide array of elements that can be done here in France to start with. So I would like also, therefore, to ask the French Parliament to act in this sense. Thank you very much, and thank you for having answered Paul Romer's question with regard to how success can be measured. And now, Gael, maybe you could answer this question.
Speak in English. I just would like to try to answer to your question, Paul, which seems to me to be very important. Namely, this refers to the question of evaluation. How do we evaluate the impact on the success of reform in terms of governance? Huge question. The first item I would provide is that certainly we cannot do it project by project, since by definition governance is not just related to one project. So which has something to do with the ongoing debate regarding, let's say, randomized control trials and these kind of things. Definitely they are out of the scope here. We have to do something else. Probably we have to go back to, old-fashioned but very interesting indicators, indices. And on this field we know that the GDP is a very bad indicator, so we have to find something else. in this direction, of course, there is, let's say, for instance, the Multidimensional Poverty Index in Oxford, the Human Development Index, etc. So it seems to me working more in this direction would certainly help. At AFD, what we have done is that we have developed an index which tries to capture the quality of social relationships. So we have called it the Relational Capability Index. And one of the lessons to be drawn from it is that you may give money to people in a village, let's say in Africa, but if this destroys the network of relationships, let's say because it increases inequality, then this will be really detrimental to the population at the end of the day. So this kind of index is a way to capture the impact of a reform in terms of governance on the quality of the social relationships between people. And then a last item I would provide is that we could ask ourselves the following question: why shouldn't we construct the index with the citizens? If we want them to be happy at the end of the day, maybe we should ask them, what do you think should be an index of your happiness? This has been done in France, in the north of France, in Lille. Of course, it's entirely non-orthodox for people in Paris, let's say, economists in Paris who would say, these are poor guys. But it seems to me this is a very promising avenue. If you think in terms of the Buen Vivir in Latin America, which is a way for the populations, especially the indigenous populations, to say, we know a little bit what makes us happy. If you think in terms of the concept of Ren in China or the Muntu in some countries in Africa, I do think people know something about what makes them happy. So maybe you should ask them.
Wow, thank you very much. That's excellent and a great way to close this phase of the presentation today. So I want to thank the panel. Please join me in thanking the panel for a very interesting set of comments. Now let me call upon my colleague Deborah Wetzel to provide concluding remarks.
So I'm also going to echo my colleagues' gratitude for hosting us here at the Assemblée Nationale, and to AFD in the land of liberté, égalité, et fraternité. It's a perfect place to kick off our WDR. We've talked a lot about the importance of understanding why our policies don't lead to effective outcomes. My responsibility in the World Bank is to lead the group, the 700 plus people that work on governance, and the role that they play in developing and supporting our other sectoral operations. And like all good WDRs, this report is a challenge to us and the teams working on the programs to think a little bit about how do we think differently, how do we do differently, and what does it mean for the road ahead for an institution like many institutions around the world that work on development that want quick results, rapid, speedy processes, and things that may not always necessarily lend themselves to the kind of depth and breadth that we've talked about. So I just want to say a few words a little bit more practically about the road ahead and some of the things that we, the World Bank as an institution, are going to be working on to try to take the depth of content of this report and think through how we apply it. Many people come to us right now and say, so you have all the answers. And of course, we do not. And I should note that many of us were here in Paris for the Open Governance Forum, working on issues such as openness, transparency, participation, accountability. So the task ahead for us is to think about how to apply these frameworks. And we have several components of how we think we need to do that. First of all, we need to fill in gaps in the diagnostics and to think and understand better how things like commitment, coordination, cooperation, how they play out in the different ways can be unpacked and defined and analyzed in ways that help us in the day-to-day frameworks. We want to look at project designs, really drill down to how these concepts can help us think differently. So in addition to going in and doing a cost-benefit analysis, we also may do a type of social or political cost-benefit analysis. We all do multi-stakeholder analysis, but thinking more profoundly about how we do that is important for us. We need to look at particular issues and sectors to see how this framework may be helpful. So energy came up, any number of areas that we work on, domestic resource mobilization, subsidies, illicit financial flows, any host of issues. So we need to explore the priorities for that. We've talked a bit about data. So how do we measure? How do we measure governance constraints, things like capture, clientelism, collusion and exclusion that the report really highlights? How do we also measure what the team usefully calls governance enablers, things like trust, legitimacy, compliance, and cohesion? And how do we also give this work a forward-looking positive spin to find a way to help us solve some of these problems that we're facing on the ground day to day? Finally, and very importantly, how do we facilitate cooperation and knowledge? So we have this fantastic report as a starting point. We are working with partners around the world to see how we can take this and move forward. And we'll be digesting within the World Bank as an institution to understand and socialize the concepts to our many people who will find these challenging, to work on finding particular applications so we can build up a body of knowledge in terms of how we can apply, what the outcomes are, and what that means for us. And then finally, what all those things mean for how as an institution we change the way in which we do business. Again, that's not going to happen overnight. I'm hopeful in the coming 5 years we may move along that path. But certainly it will change what we do and how we do it. And so my compliments to the team and my thanks to you all for hosting us here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Maintenant, j'ai l'honneur d'inviter M. Rémi Rioux, le directeur général de l'Agence française de
I'm delighted to invite Mr. Rémi Rioux to close the talk. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good evening. It's not easy to conclude such a fantastic meeting. It's a very difficult task after such brilliant presentations and ideas. Thank you, all of you. I would first of all start by underlining the double honor that we have this evening and that I'm particularly delighted about as the director of the Agence Française de Développement. It's the honor to be here at the Parliament. Several of you have brought that up. What more beautiful area than to talk about governance and law. Such a place as this, as the French National Assembly. It's loaded with history where thank you, Mr. Député, Mr. Jean-Marie Tétart, for your involvement in this event, and through you also we thank, of course, the indispensable work of the representatives of the nation and the presence at our side, AFD, always constructive and always inspiring, and you also played naturally a huge role with the relaunch last year of our policy of development. I would also like to underline the huge honor that we have here today. I don't know if you're all quite aware of this, of having the World Bank, the launch each year of the report of the World Development Report is a major event throughout the world in research. Each and every one of you, I'm sure, remember one or several reports in the past which have been major milestones in the way the international community reflected. I remember the one of 2005 on climate, 2008 on agriculture, 2011 also on the countries in crisis. So, of course, the one of last year, which I invite you to read also with regard to the digital development and what is at stake, and that's my view, but there are many others. But if you look at the list of reports, you see every time that the searchers from the World Bank have truly been ahead of the game, and that, of course, that's their role in the international community with regard to the identification of the major topics. So thank you to all of you. It's really a huge mark of confidence, of trust to have done this launch launch in Paris here at the Assemblée Nationale. I think it's the first time, indeed, that the launch has not taken place in Washington. So I really hope to see you here again, and that you'll do it elsewhere. And Paul Romer and all of us, we are extremely delighted about that. And of course, I see a sign of the excellent relationship that exists between our two institutions. We're going to meet up again in a few days, next week indeed, with Jim Keen, with our teams in Washington, to deep further and to build further on the relationship between AFD and the World Bank. Governance will be a major theme. Gaël will be here, Gaël Giraud, Jean-François Almenza. They're already working very hard on preparing this meeting. It's a major report which has been presented to us this evening. You've all said that. It draws attention to the asymmetries that can exist with the powers that can be. With regard, it looks at the institutions, the necessity of having a dynamic vision, the role of law and the state of law. It also underlines, and I think that's important, the specificity of each national context, of each even territorial context, that it's indispensable to understand and integrate that into our programs of development. It invites us to a lot of modesty, to be very modest and humble. A certain number of directors of agency are here with us this evening. Of course, those are messages that they hear absolutely, and something that we understand, us practitioners of development. It also demonstrates at what point the interactions between all the actors of a territory, private and public, they have to be understood, all those relationships to arrive at success. And Gaël Giraud reminded us of that on the 1st and 2nd of December, when we had a meeting in the context of the 75th anniversary of AFD around the issues of commons, and that appears throughout your report. These forms of governance, which are neither 100% public nor 100% private nor public, and they're adapted to the management of certain shared goods. So we measure, of course, we're well aware of this vision, this very close look at the specificities of governance is certainly a rupture, a big rupture, and a crucial one if we want to draw all the operational consequences and ideas that we can from it. And I believe that the diversity and the number of people and participants here in this very room shows that you're the representatives of those who make governance here in France, and who contribute also in the countries and the territories in development. You're representatives of public authorities here, ministers, ambassadors, a lot of NGOs also. And thank you, Frédéric, for your words, strong words, motivating words for us, for the NGOs, who of course carry out their own development work, but they also do advocacy work with regard to governance, so that we never forget the voice of the poorest people. The research world is also present here and represented, and we are also invited, a certain number of you who are here with us, the representatives of the Conseil d'État, of the Conseil supérieur d'État, the Conseil national du barreau, so from the worlds of the legal world. We also wanted to invite professionals from the legal world here in France, and I'm personally very delighted that you're here with us and that you've accepted our invitation, because it's the first time really that we meet up. AFD has competencies and specializations, sectorial specializations in a lot of domains, but not that much in the domain of law beyond our own legal needs. So whereas, and we've heard that throughout this meeting today, that it's an absolute fundamental dimension with regard to development. I know that myself, because I contributed a bit in past years with Paul Deslondres. I'm delighted to mention his name with regard to the promotion of the law of OEDA in a certain number of countries throughout Africa. So it was a magnificent meeting that we had here this evening, and I'll conclude with a few words. It's not a fortuitous one, and the final message that I wanted to put to you, it arrives at a very important moment for the Agence Française de Développement, who is, as you know, committed to a transformation, a profound transformation. Without we're not really sure exactly when that transformation will become good, but you know that a stronger agency is going, and a more relevant one is going to come out of this transformation. Gaël reminded us in 2016 the French government took the decision to transfer the competence of governance from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and of International Development towards the Agence Française de Développement, and that is part of this relaunch of the development of our policy that I was talking about earlier on. We are resolutely, we've embraced that resolutely, and we're working very hard on it. We're not the World Bank, but we've done approximately 700 million euros of financing in this first year, 2016, in this intervention within the field of governance, and we're close to the commitment that was the objective that was given to us, which was of 800 million euros per year by 2020. So we're moving forward. Of course, there's a lot that we need to learn because we're just starting out. So like Mr. Jourdain from Molière, we need to take governance as a topic of which is really standalone, which is it's very important for the Agence Française de Développement, and we're designing our roadmap in this domain, working with the civil society and incorporating, of course, the lessons which come out of your report. This roadmap which will cover governance, which is the state of law, the essential functions of the states, working closely with the actors and the exercise of the law, and we'll also be talking about the sectorial governance that we know better in each of our sectors of intervention. The organization itself of the Agence Française de Développement is going to we're going to have within our company a division that we're going to baptize political and citizen transition. So we're really bringing this word of politics with all the modesty that it requires, but we're bringing it to the forefront. And it's a shape of intervention in such dynamics, and we need to take that on board and then really look to work in the most respectful and most efficient way possible. And then there are 4 other sectorial divisions, departments in our new organization, which is a transition one. So it's energetic transition, demographic transition, digital and transition, and territorial transition. Each one of those divisions is going to contribute to a section which is in the field of governance. So we're going to work on that, carry on working hard on all that, and moving forward, and try and measure over the coming months, years, what an agency, a bilateral agency, can bring in such a domain. Because naturally, we're not the World Bank, I repeat, but we'll never have a World Development Report. This sum of the best practices, this sum of research. It's only the World Bank, and that's your role once more in the international system to carry that out. But however, having said that, I believe that we can bring something to the debate, which is a combination at once of an intelligence of the most accurate and most analytical intelligence and knowledge of the countries in which we intervene. It's not easy, and we have to go as far as possible in understanding the dynamics of governance, and sometimes we know better some countries than others, and with all the modesty that I believe that I need, I think that we can bring something to the table. And we're also a bilateral agency, so we have to bring, without being prescriptive, we have to bring the knowledge of our own and the intelligence of our own modes of governance, of our own institutional systems. I think that is crucial. Of course, this system, we have it in our minds. It's in when we intervene, we always have that. We need to. When you have the knowledge, you need to study it. And it can be a counterpoint, and it can be something that makes us aware of how we can carry out in the best possible way the development, which is what we are, which is our objective. So we really need to work on that to clarify the situation and base an action on that, which can have an added value. And of course, everything that we can do together, we need to look at everything that we can do with the French actors. I'm thinking about the different expertise, the Expertise France also, which is a major partner of the agency, also the Caisse des Dépôts et Consignations, of course, with who we've built an alliance. alliance, a very strategic alliance in last December. And the Caisse des Dépôts manages the monies which are deposited and is very linked, very closely linked to the life of professional legal specialists in France. So in this alliance, we're discovering this world also, and I believe that we can grow. This alliance can help us grow and learn. At the end of the day, respond even better, maybe, to the demands that are put upon us by the countries, the developing countries. So I'll conclude there. So you can see there's still a lot to be explored, to be discovered, but the report arrives really at the right moment for us in the way we are thinking about the future, about what we're doing. And beyond this meeting of this evening, I really hope that we develop links which are even stronger with the World Bank. We already have strong links, and we're going to go even further and with each and every one of you. So please come to us and exchange with us and give us your feedback. And we have to put in place more actions development in the countries our beloved countries, and where we have the mandate to intervene. Thank you.
So the professor and me can't let us go without a homework assignment. So let me suggest, Debbie, your remarks included the observation that measuring governance might be, or defining it and measuring it might be easier in particular sectors. We have the next WDR on education coming up. Perhaps we should make it a task for us to think about a goal, a definition of success from that, which is not just have kids score higher on tests, but perhaps see if we can make concrete work towards having schools that are better governed and do many things, including generate better test scores. So that's our homework. And for Remy, we can talk next week in Washington about whether specifically on education there's some opportunities to work together. Thank you.